This is Of Men and Dragons, Chapter 27 by DrBlackjack21. Embrel noticed that while breakfast and dinner had always been a favorite time for everyone, that was especially true these days now that it was the only time all four of them were able to get together anymore. They'll tell each other about their plans for the day during breakfast. Then they'd talk about how the day had gone during dinner. There was laughter, teasing, sarcasm, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the room's physical temperature. Whenever Embrel and Angela were away from the table, they would catch Jack and Shahar glancing at each other like they were both wanting to say something but seemed to feel that now wasn't the right time. The anticipation was killing her, and Embrel knew it was just a matter of time before those two hit a boiling point. Until then, she'd simply have to enjoy the view. Shahar and Lonthal had been surprisingly successful in their hunts. The two had been at it for only about a week, but the meat supplies were nearly plentiful enough that Lonthal could handle the rest on his own again. They were currently eating a breakfast that Jack had called steak and eggs, a meal whose name was also the description. Shahar was talking about the hunting progress as they ate.
I think a day or two more is all we'll need. With a bit of luck, we'll have enough meat in storage to feed everyone for a month, without having to tap into your ship's stores.
Jack looked like someone trying to hide how excited he was and failing. That's great! We could use your help with construction again. We've got the first building ready, but we need more lumber. Embrel has a hard time moving the trunks the way you do. She's not quite as, developed as you. He was doing his best not to stare at Shahar's physique as he spoke, and Shahar wasn't doing anything to hide from his glances. Embrel couldn't help but let a small giggle escape, which immediately caused the two romantic interests to suddenly shift their focus. Jack was rubbing the back of his neck in his now signature move, indicating embarrassment. Even Shahar's tendrils shook in mild embarrassment as the human changed subjects. We, have the cables laid for the, transceiver? Embrel and I were going to hook it up today. What direction are you going hunting in today? Shahar's manner shifted back to business in her attempt to redirect the attention away from herself.
We're going to be venturing to the south today. It's been several days since we last hunted there, so there's been enough time for some animals to move back into the territory.
Jack had finally calmed down a bit and returned to his natural pallor. That's good. South. Good. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Angela and Embrel were looking at each other, laughing to themselves. These two were so awkwardly adorable. Sadly, the time for talking was coming to an end. Shahar was suiting up for the cold and storing her weapons for travel. Jack spoke up as he watched her prepare. Hey, be careful out there, okay? I know I say it every day, and I know you laugh it off, but I want you to come home safe and sound. After all, what would I do without my bodyguard? The weather could turn any day. Shahar was securing her spears so they wouldn't jostle loose easily, but could be quickly grabbed if the need arose. Finally, she turned and somewhat gently grabbed Jack by the shoulder.
I'll be fine. We keep a close eye on the weather as we work, and even if something unexpected happens, that's why we have the tent and all those extra heating pads. You'll just have to come to fetch us once the snow dies down, if it comes to that.
Jack nodded and visibly calmed himself. Yeah, you're right. Still, just promise me you'll keep an eye out for trouble. Shahar looked like she wanted to step closer to Jack to say or do something more for a moment before the spell broke. Instead, she shook her head to clear it.
All right, I'll be careful. Take care of Embrel and yourself while I'm gone. You two are too good at getting into trouble whenever I'm not around.
Jack watched as she walked out the door. He told himself she'd be fine, and he needed to stop worrying. All right, it's a deal. Be safe out there. When she was gone, Jack stared into the gloom of the cave for a moment before shaking his head, then turning back to the house. He had to get ready for his own day of work. Embrel finished putting away the dishes and obviously hadn't been eavesdropping for the last couple of minutes. Jack turned and smiled. Ready to go out and hook up the transceiver? After that, we can go back to the lake and get some more materials for the daub. But this time, Angela can come along for the ride. Emerald and Angela were jumping up and down, clapping at the idea, and Jack couldn't help but feel a bit of their excitement. All right, let's do this. You're going to have to carry the transceiver, since I don't want to be walking out into the workers' area in my mining suit. I figure we should keep a few aces in the hole. Lucky for you, it's not too heavy. Yes, you. After carrying the transceiver most of the way on her own, Emerald was starting to think Jack's definition of not too heavy was drastically different from hers. Once they had gotten out of the cave, Telron had come over to help. He was inspecting the impossibly perfect metal shell.
That's amazing. I've never seen anything like this. The purity of the metal alone is worth a year's wage, if not more, and I don't even know what the device does.
As soon as they settled the transceiver down into the mounting Jack and Emerald had set up the day before, Jack was inspecting every inch of the device. It was mounted on top of a large rock just outside the entrance. It was so heavy because of all the layers of protection that Angela installed to guard against weather and wildlife. She'd proudly proclaimed that it could shrug off even a direct lightning strike if need be. Despite the claim, Jack set it up low enough that he hoped they wouldn't have to test her theory. As he tightened down the bolts, Jack decided to tell Telron at least part of the truth. It would be evidence soon enough, so he might as well give the Smith something. Well, hopefully this will allow us to communicate with each other over large distances. It will require a headset, and I can't make too many of them just yet. But even if it's only available to a few of us, it could mean the difference between life and death in the field. Telron looked at Jack as though he were speaking in riddles.
This feels more like dragon magic to me. I'll stick to learning new alloys, thank you.
As the smith walked away, Jack hooked up the power and took out a pair of headsets. They were a simple design, with an earpiece on one side and a mic extended towards the mouth. The set was held in place by an adjustable metal circlet that wrapped around the head. It was designed to be durable and hard to lose during intense action. It also had a few sensors, so Angela could ride along with whoever was wearing one. As Emerald and himself put on the headsets and activated them, Jack spoke into the receiver. Angela, are you with us? Angela's voice came through loud and clear for both of them.
Finally, a new input. I could only scan the interior of the ship and the surrounding mountain a few trillion more times before I went insane from a lack of new stimuli.
Emerald was looking around, half expecting Angela's avatar to show up next to her. Also, it was slightly disorienting hearing Jack's voice twice, a split second apart. Jack responded to Angela while she adjusted. You know, you can't go insane if you're already insane. Though I suppose you could go more insane. Angela didn't bother to respond. She was too wrapped up in her new sensors.
I didn't get much of a chance to scan the area when you were crashing down. This place is beautiful. It would feel a little like an Icelandic forest, if the trees didn't look so weird.
Emerald was looking up at the trees inquisitively.
What's wrong with the trees?
As Jack and Emerald approached the lake, Angela was still busy going on about the planet's flora and fauna.
This is a perfect example of convergent evolution. I mean, there are many, many differences, sure, but they are still clearly plants that follow the same rules as Earth. Trees, bushes, and ground matter are similar in nature, if not form, to what we'd see in any Earth forest. The animals are a bit harder to place, often riding a line between what we would consider a different species, but still clearly have the basic forms and senses you would expect on Earth. Eyes, ears, mouth, and noses are all there. Admittedly, sometimes in different quantities and forms than would be usual where we came from, but still amazingly similar given completely separate evolutionary origins. Jack was barely listening to her, as his attention stayed focused on the weather. He would steal a glance behind them to the south at every opportunity. However, Jack couldn't focus all his time and energy on worrying about Shahar. He had a job to do. Emerald was focused on getting the fibrous plant matter while Jack got the mud and clay. The latter, being the colder job, made Jack's exothermic physique better suited to the task. They were more than halfway done when Emerald stopped Jack. She was holding some sandwiches.
I know you're probably too distracted at the moment to realize, but we both need some food. You won't do anyone any favors by collapsing because you neglected yourself.
Jack looked up and wiped his brow. Despite the crisp air, he'd worked up a sweat with his shoveling. Yeah, you make a good point. Grab a towel for me, will you? He walked over to the stream feeding into the lake and washed off the gunk he'd caked on. That's when he heard Angela say something in a stern but forcibly calm voice that made his blood turn to ice.
Emerald, don't move!
Jack turned as slowly as he could force himself to move, but the sight before him didn't do anything to ease his mind. Emerald was by the cart they'd brought with them, towel in hand. Just behind her was the tree line, on the edge of which was a kovac, horn lowered and pawing the ground. He'd obviously walked out of the trees just after Emerald had turned her back to him, and he looked pissed that these two interlopers had dared to invade his territory. Jack's mind raced. He'd brought his gun, but it was in the cart next to Emerald. Maybe if Jack could shout and make himself look big, he could scare the beast off. But given that it seemed to show no fear of an Argun, he doubted a human would have any luck in that endeavor. Maybe Emerald could race for the gun, but she didn't know how to use it. Perhaps she could get the gun and toss it to Jack? Then the time for thought was over. The kovac launched itself forward, and Jack did the same. As his foot slammed into the ground, Jack shouted, "Emerald, run!" But the poor girl simply looked behind herself in confusion. Jack's second foot slammed into the ground, launching himself forward while the kovac did the same. Emerald gasped and froze in place, her instincts choosing the worst possible option between fight, flight, or freeze. Jack's first foot struck the ground again, and he and the kovac both narrowed the distance between their shared target. Jack wanted to shout at the monster, shout directions to Emerald, or just shout at his frustration, but every ounce of oxygen was needed to force his muscles past their normal limits. Jack's other foot slammed into the ground, propelling him forward faster than ever, but he wasn't the only one gaining momentum. The kovac lowered its head, the horn pointed right at Emerald's chest. Something in the girl's mind clicked, and her brain switched from freeze to flight, but it was going to be too late. She'd never get out of the way in time. Jack's first foot slammed into the ground one last time, propelling him into his young charge with as much momentum as his adrenaline-filled body could muster, but the kovac slammed into the two of them barely a half-second later. There was blood everywhere, and Emerald was screaming. Despite his best efforts, he'd been too late. As his failure stabbed into him, all the adrenaline seeped out of Jack, and his limbs hung down from his body like lead weights. Barely a second passed when Jack noticed something was off about the girl's screams. They were not the screams of a painful death. Those were the screams of loss and rage. Feeling himself oddly jerked to the side, Jack looked down and noticed a horn protruding from his chest. All he could think was, well, that's all right then. Emerald had been flung to the side by Jack, but was now racing towards the kovac that was currently shaking Jack loose from its horn. He held out a hand to the girl and tried to say, "No, this is okay, you're safe. That's what's important." But all that came out was a cough of blood and a gurgling sound. Jack didn't have many choices after that. His body was getting heavier by the minute, and it was all he could do to keep his eyes open and watch Emerald make her charge. At some point, the ground had leapt up to meet Jack, now that Emerald and the kovac were fighting sideways, standing on the new wall of grass and dirt. A small part of his brain told Jack that there was something wrong with his observations, but all his remaining attention was reserved for Emerald's well-being. He had no energy to spare for something as insignificant as mere physics. Emerald's scream was something to hear. It was a defiant rage that seemed to shout to the world that she wouldn't let it take anything else from her. Jack couldn't help but think that Shahar would be proud. The girl leapt impossibly high into the air, reaching both arms behind herself as she did so. The kovac seemed at a loss for what to do and simply raised his horn to meet her and waited. Jack was worried that the kovac would impale Emerald just as he had Jack, but when the girl came down, she had her arms just off to either side of the horn, and her head twisted just out of its reach. Emerald put all her weight into the blow as she drove the spikes on her elbows into the beast's skull. It immediately collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Seeing that Embryl was safe, Jack finally allowed the darkness at the edge of his vision to rush in, and all the problems in his world suddenly ceased to exist. Embryl was rearing back to strike the beast a second time. One of her elbow spikes had torn off in her assault. Her whole arm was numb, and blood was pouring out from where the spike had been, but she didn't care. There was no way she could punish the corpse of the Kovac enough for what it had taken from her, but she was going to try. That's when Angela spoke up in her ear. "Embryl, I need you to listen to me. I still might be able to save Jack, but you have to get him back to the medbay on the ship as fast as possible. Every second is vital. Now go!" Embryl had 1,000 questions swirling around in her mind. Every one of them centered around the ridiculous idea of saving the obviously dead man she had come to care for so genuinely in such a short time. But Angela had said every second was vital, and so Embryl shoved every thought to the side and launched into action. Picking up Jack's body, a small part of her mind took note of just how tiny and light he was. He'd seemed so much more imposing moments before when he'd shoved her out of the way. Embryl shoved that thought out of the way as well and started to run. Angela was speaking in her ear as she moved. "The human brain can only go about 6 minutes without blood flow before the damage becomes permanent. You've got about a half-mile to go. If you can get Jack to me in that time, there's a chance." Hearing that, Embryl pushed herself harder. Launching forward, she ignored anything other than running. Trees flew past. Startled animals dove for cover. Icy winds pelted her face. It started snowing, but Embryl ran on. As she ran, her breaths became ragged, and she cursed herself as her pace slowed slightly while she gasped for air, but she ran on. At one point, her foot snagged on a root hidden from view, but Embryl only stumbled for a moment before she resumed her run. Her vision was getting blurry. Her legs felt as though her muscles were tearing themselves from her bones, but the girl ran on. Eventually, the camp came into sight, but Embryl didn't have any reserves left to feel something as unimportant as relief or hope. Precious seconds were slipping past. As she ran past unseen workers, they noticed the girl was not running, so much as rapidly stumbling. When someone reached out to slow her in an attempt to help, the young Argoon merely snapped her jaws at him and almost bit a few fingers off, all without slowing her stumbling pace. Into the cave, Embryl ran on. Reaching the house, Embryl fell against the walls in her stumbling attempts to reach the medbay in time. Angela was doing her best to guide the completely exhausted Embryl the last little bit. "You have to get him to the medbay. You're almost there, but I can't help unless you go a little further. Please, just a little further." Picking herself off her knees, Embryl lurched the rest of the way. Angela was still speaking. "Into the chair there. Just set him down, and then I can do the rest." With a final gasp of effort, the young girl dropped Jack into the chair that was fading from view, threw up in the corner, then passed out. Shahar was returning to camp just in time. Jack's feeling this morning had been spot on. A storm was coming. It didn't look like it would be too rough, but it was better to err on the side of caution, so she and Lothal had started back early. The Kovac and the Churlish tied to the sled would just about top them off anyway. She'd been worried once or twice that they'd have to settle in for the storm, but eventually the camp came into view, and she sighed in relief. A few of the workers were waving at them, obviously relieved that they'd made it back safely. But there was something odd about the waves. Telron approached at a run, stopped just shy as he rested his hands on his knees to gasp for air. His explanation came out between gasping breaths.
"Embryl came back this morning to camp carrying Jack. He didn't look good. When I tried to help, she practically bit my hand off and kept running into the cave. That's the last we've seen of them. We were just debating on whether we should venture into the cave or not."
Shahar dropped everything she was carrying and took off into the cave at a dead run. She was a blur of motion as she crossed the familiar landscape in record time. The ship's door was open. Shahar launched herself inside and tore through the living area into the medbay. Jack was laid on a chair that had been turned into a table. Far too many of his insides were exposed to the air. Metal arms were poking and prodding his body as they dug around inside the corpse. Shahar was ready to jump to his side when Angela appeared in front of her, hands held out and a pleading look on her face. "Stop! Jack is in a critical moment right now, and I might be able to save him, but anything could tip the balance. Even your breath could be a threat to him." Shahar looked at the AI with unthinking eyes, and for a moment seemed like she might try and walk past anyway, when a weak hand grabbed her by the ankle. Looking down, Shahar saw a pitiful-looking Emerald feebly holding on with what little strength she had left. Her body was so bruised and broken she barely looked alive herself. The girl was lying in a pool of her own vomit. Her legs looked as though they'd been beaten until they could no longer work. One of her elbow spikes was missing. The blood clotting at the end made it clear it had not been treated. Her voice came out small and feeble.
Let her work. Jack, Angela, she needs all her attention right now.
The sight of the young girl in such agony but trying desperately to help Angela was enough to snap Shahar out of her daze. She still desperately wanted to reach Jack's side but held herself in check.
Is there anything I can do to help?
Angela looked relieved for a moment before sparing a worried glance over her shoulder as she spoke. Honestly, no. I'll know more in about an hour, but at this time it could go either way. Embryl almost literally tore herself apart getting Jack to me in time, but I haven't had the chance to treat her. I'm still trying to stabilize Jack and don't have much to spare. Shahar nodded and stood there a moment longer, staring at the lifeless body that used to be Jack. Metal arms were sticking out of his stomach like some horrible insect digging its way into him, but Shahar knew that Angela was second to none in her concern for her brother. So Shahar nodded a second time, for her own benefit as much as for Angela's, and reached down to gently pick up the young Argoon from off the ground.
All right. Let's at least get you cleaned up.
Over the next hour, Shahar washed and bandaged Embryl while the young Argoon got the story out between sobs of fear and frustration and the occasional gasp of pain at Shahar's treatments of her injuries. She told the story of the Kovac charging, Jack shoving her out of the way, Embryl killing the Kovac, and finally running Jack back to the ship. Embryl was still sobbing as she spoke.
I wasn't able to protect him.
Shahar was applying a bandage to the end of the girl's missing spike as she spoke.
Hush. It's not your job to protect Jack. It's Jack's job to protect you, which he did. Besides, from the sound of things, there's no way he could have carried you back to the cave in time. You did well. If Jack lives, he'll owe it all to you.
That was the moment when an exhausted and bedraggled Angela made an appearance before the two of them. Well, he's alive. Kind of. Embryl looked worried and confused, but Shahar simply narrowed her eyes in suspicion.
What do you mean, kind of?
The AI pointed them to the medbay as she spoke. That's complicated. You can come see him while I try to explain. As Shahar walked into the room, Jack's body was laid out on the reclined chair. He looked smaller and frailer than ever, and his face was far too pale even for a human. Shahar would have thought he was dead if not for Angela's insistence otherwise. Jack's sister looked both relieved and defeated, looking down at Jack's body with sadness as she explained. Well, Jack's stable. All his vitals are fine, and I'm confident I can finish healing the damage done to his body, though it will take quite some time. Angela took a deep breath while Shahar and Embryl waited for her to continue. The problem is, he's not waking up. The amount of damage sustained was immense, and despite Embryl breaking every expectation I had of her capacity, Jack went a long time without proper blood flow to his brain. Normally, once he was stabilized like this, I'd fly him to the nearest proper facility for better, more in-depth treatment than I can offer in this emergency medbay. However, that's beyond my capacity at the moment. So we'll just have to do whatever we can with what we've got. Right now, he's in what we call a coma, a kind of deep sleep on the border between life and death. He might wake up in a day, a week, a month, or never. It's impossible to say. At this point, all I can do is heal his body and hope. When Embryl spoke this time, her voice came out small and frightened.
What do we do?
Shahar's face hardened as she stared down at the man she'd come to know so well in such a short time.
There's only one thing we can do. Jack has a plan in place that he's put everything on the line for, and Angela's very life depends on that plan. So, we continue to work to make his vision a reality.
Angela and Emerald were looking at Shahar with surprise clear on their faces. But the AI quickly switched to a bittersweet smile. Jack, well, when he wakes up, he'll be proud of you both. But you both need your rest. There's nothing that can be done tonight that can't be done tomorrow. Get some sleep. Doctor's orders. The two Argun nodded wearily, and Shahar helped Emerald get into bed before finding her own. Even when the lights faded, she continued staring up into the dark ceiling long into the night. Emerald and her father were traveling across the plains again, but this time when they got captured, it was Jack she watched get murdered. While he died, Dolgen laughed at Emerald, telling her there would be no one to save her this time. Emerald shot awake in an instant, but it took a moment for the dream to fade enough that she could place where she was and what had happened the day before. Tears started flowing as her memories returned, and it took her several minutes to calm herself back down again. Once she did, she realized something was off in the room. She was alone. She'd gotten so used to sleeping with Shahar in the room that Shahar's absence left Emerald feeling almost as vulnerable as the dream had. The girl slowly and painfully dragged herself out of the bed. All her limbs were in agony. Every movement sent pain shooting up and down her nerves, but Emerald wasn't about to give up just because of a little thing like that. Eventually, the room lit up with a gentle glow that told her Angela was beside her. Emerald turned while wrapping the blanket around herself, as much for the feeling of safety as for the warmth.
Where's Shahar?
Angela looked at Emerald as though she wanted to protest the girl getting out of bed before she had a chance to heal. Instead, she shook her head and answered, She's in the med bay with Jack. Emerald nodded and limped over to the bay. Opening the door, she saw Shahar sitting in a chair beside Jack. Her head was resting on her arms, which were lying on Jack's legs. She was asleep, but Emerald could see the trails her tears had left. Emerald brought another chair over. When Shahar startled awake, Emerald wordlessly wrapped her in the blanket as well, and they both settled in beside Jack. It wasn't as comfortable as their beds had been, but Jack's presence somehow chased away the nightmares for the rest of the night. In their dreams, the three of them shared breakfast, laughter, and bacon.